So hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us. My name is Arka Ray. I'm the managing director of the Data Economics Company. And once again, welcome to the Data Economics Festival. I am here today with my very old friend, Vaibhav Rikye, to talk about the influence of digital data on the future of the independent, quote unquote, gig worker economy. If you are joining us for your first session at the festival, then you can learn a lot more about it by going to lydion.com/festival, which is lydion.com/festival, where you can find content related to some 20 plus sessions and around how digital data and economics intersect, as well as a lot of fun happy hour style events, such as a virtual golf clinic, a sing along, which are both tonight. We had a really fun cocktail hour last night, which will probably rerun very soon. We are really excited to bring all of these topics across such a broad set of themes, sectors that all focus on how digital data is meaningfully transforming economics, and hence, how we lead our lives and think about generating and exchanging value. So we are very interested in your thoughts on what you would like us to bring to you next, because as you might have heard, we are definitely planning a lot more over the summer, going to the end of the year, as far as the continuation of what we are starting here this week with the festival. So with that said, let's turn to Vaibhav, who, as I said, I have known for almost 20 years now, since we were together as undergraduates in college. So Vaibhav, do you want to maybe give us a bit of background on what you have been up to since then?
Yeah, that's going pretty far back, but thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me on the platform, and always a pleasure to speak with you guys. So since we finished undergrad at UC Berkeley, where we were together, I started working in consulting for a few years. I worked at Deloitte, doing some systems and management consulting. After doing that for a few years, I went to business school, and then I came out of that and worked in investment banking, covering tech mostly, and a little bit of healthcare for a few years. And then at some point, I made the decision that I wanted to go be back at an operating company, and I took up a role at Uber back in 2014 when the company had sort of found product market fit and was growing quite rapidly. And basically, the core was, how do we use data and research to tweak the product market fit and find ways to drive more efficient growth while holding on to our lofty market share ambitions. So that's a lot of what I've been focused on for the last 6.5, 7 years. It's actually going to be my last day at Uber tomorrow. And in the last 6.5, 7 years, I spent a lot of time focused on the rides business, and basically looking at everything from acquisition and engagement and retention of riders and drivers, pricing strategies, understanding the marketplace at Uber, looking at Uber Pool, and a variety of different things, all things sort of strategy and sort of core operations, with, of course, analytics, data-driven lens on it.
Thank you so much, Vaibhav. I really appreciate that. So, given Vaibhav's background, I think one of the things that we have all thought about at some point or the other, or used at some point or the other, is some services enabled by what we call the independent worker, independent gig economy. And the rise of this gig economy, enabled by rideshare, food delivery, and other technology-backed applications, has brought conveniences to millions and employment to millions around the world. Yet there are several challenges that are faced by the workers in gig economies, by the companies themselves in balancing their priorities with the priorities of the workers, the priorities of the consumers, as well as a lot of challenges that is focused on unit economics, pricing, value, scale, and so on and so forth. So in today's chat with Vaibhav, we want to explore how digital data specifically that's being generated within these gig economies by the participants in such economies can enable more value to the drivers and the workers within these economies, to the consumers, riders, and others within the economy, value to the companies that is enabling this ecosystem, as well as more value to the overall ecosystem and the infrastructure that the gig economy is operating within. Um, and by extension, how can some of these challenges that are being faced by these companies, by workers, by consumers, be addressed by more effective utilization, more creative utilization, developing more interesting markets for the utilization of worker data, consumer data, getting credit back to the workers and the consumers while protecting their interests, privacy, and so on. So with that background, Vaibhav, why don't we just start with the basics? Why is the independent, the gig economy important? Why is it such a big deal?
Yeah, it's a great question, a great place to start. Let me actually just quickly add a caveat before I begin around the fact that most of what we discussed today, or any of the opinions or point of views that I might share, are very much my own and in no way, shape, or form affiliated with Uber or reflects Uber's position on these topics. So I'm very much speaking here in a strictly personal capacity. With that out of the way, let's move to the question that you just asked, which which is an interesting one, and I think you touched on this in even how you phrased the question, which is really that most of us think of the gig economy as something that's exploded in the last 6, 8, 10 years with the advent of platforms like Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, TaskRabbit, maybe eBay, if you go back a little bit further. But the reality is that gig economy or independent work is actually much broader than this. And there's a lot of people that for a long time have been doing, independent consulting type work or independent work that basically pays them on a gig basis, and it's done in a part-time manner. And that's really what the gig economy is actually about. And what's basically happened over the last 8-10 years is a lot of these platforms like Uber and Lyft have popularized the gig economy and brought it maybe a bit more mainstream as a function of the tech that's been built over the last 10-15 years, the iPhone or the mobile phone being maybe one of the biggest factors that drove that. But broadly, if you look at some of the estimates, so for example, McKinsey did a study and they estimated that 20 to 30% of the US and European population engages in some form of independent work, whether it's full-time or part-time. And you think about that number, and that's a really, really large number. So you're basically looking at something like, I don't know, 35 to 50 million of people in the US engaging in some form of independent work or gig work, if you can call it that. So it's really large. And you sort of wonder, okay, why is that the case? And, it's basically around the fact that people either cannot do or don't want to do traditional 9-to-5 jobs that have particular set commitments to traditional employers, and they use gig economy for either their primary source of income, or in that particular case, or as a supplementary source of income in other cases. Some people like being able to operate autonomously, independently. They don't really want to be managed by a boss or have their schedule dictated to them. Some people like the flexibility in their schedule because they've got other life needs like taking care of kids or parents or other things that they need to, or their own healthcare needs that they need to solve around. And so, people are finding that the gig economy actually is better aligned with how you live your life than is the traditional working model of a 9-to-5 gig where you go somewhere to a physical location and sit there and do something, which is obviously a legacy impact from some of the early days of the Industrial Revolution and various other things. So that's a little bit of why it happens and how big it is, and it's actually growing, I don't know, 2-3 times faster than traditional employment is growing. So it's already large, and it's becoming a larger and larger part of our society today. And I think people are just catching on to that as a function of some of these things. Now, it actually has a number of benefits for our economy and for our society. There's also a few drawbacks which you cited. But in addition to some of the benefits that I just mentioned, other things are that when you have a model like this, it actually helps you cushion unemployment. And the way it does that is when you're going through a little bit of a recession or a downturn, kind of like we are right now, um, people that find themselves out of work can easily go and join one of these platforms and start, either providing labor, providing a service, or providing an asset they own, as selling that, kind of like Airbnb does. And you can start doing that and earning money quite quickly, which then allows you to, reduce your reliance on unemployment insurance, or reduce your reliance on having to take out a large loan to bridge you between two different jobs, or while you're unemployed. And that actually has pretty significant long-term implications for economies, the amount of debt they take on, and the habit building that you see, where people don't get into the habit of relying on social welfare, unemployment insurance, which has longer term challenges. And so basically you're cushioning unemployment, you're improving labor force participation, the supplemental income that these platforms provide, let's assume it's supplemental, then actually stimulates demand back into the economy, and then actually helps improve your GDP and helps improve the economy at large. And some of these tech-driven platforms or models are actually quite a bit more efficient than the traditional, non-tech or less tech way of doing things. And so that efficiency is also ultimately reflected in in productivity and GDP, all that stuff. And the basic model is you use tech to set up this platform. People can just show up, they can get paid, they can start and stop immediately, they can start and stop flexibly. And there's, in theory, an unlimited ability for people to join some of these platforms and start earning money, which is actually hugely valuable when you put it into the context that I just described. And the other benefit is that this actually also changes how it is that we actually look for work. So what I mean by that is, if you look at the vast majority of the population, let's say they happen to lose their job, and now they're under some financial duress or financial stress, odds are that they're going to take the first job they can find next, because they have financial needs to do that. But if you've got a fallback option like an Uber, Lyft, a TaskRabbit, something like that, you don't have to jump on the first thing that you see under the financial stress. You can actually take your time in finding your next job, which more aligns with what you might actually want to do, which furthers your career or furthers your happiness, whatever that might be. So that's another kind of like underlooked component of this whole thing. That said, I'll be the first to admit that the model isn't really perfect, and it's still in its early stages of evolution. And what I mean by that is that there are a number of issues or areas that need to be iterated and worked upon, that will help make the gig economy model more sustainable, more appealing to all its constituents. And specifically, some of those things are, if you're doing gig work today, odds are that you don't really have any benefits like you do in the traditional models. You don't really have health insurance. You don't have a retirement plan. You don't have sick pay or anything that sort of provides income security for you. Those are some of the challenges that need to be worked on. And I would say maybe the one other one that I know we'll touch on in more depth is, the gig economy isn't completely connected to your traditional finance setup or to your traditional ecosystem that is very much based on the traditional 9-to-5 single employer model. And so if you take two examples here, the first being credit, which is, and we'll touch on this in more depth later in the conversation, but credit is very much built around a traditional 9-to-5 W-2 employer model. It doesn't work very well when you start doing independent work or gig economy work. And then, maybe taxes is another example, which is entirely set up around a W-2 model. And if you are working independently and you've got to figure out how to track your expenses and income and all that stuff, that also doesn't align very well. So those are a few of the challenges around the gig economy that probably need work to solve.
Thank you, Vaibhav. That was such a comprehensive overview of both the massive advantages that this particular gig economy has for all of the participants involved, but also the challenges. And all of these sound like challenges that can and should be figured out in terms of this kind of things you're talking about. making the tax system more favorable for gig economy workers, credit more accessible. These seem like obvious benefits that should be available to participants who are actually producing such a positive impact on the economy in general. So having looked at both these advantages and some of these challenges, if we start focusing on, I mean, obviously you have, as part of your work and as part of, what Uber and other companies are doing in this ecosystem, obviously you're constantly thinking about how to bring more value to, your consumers, to the workers, and obviously to the company and its shareholders. But if we just focused specifically on digital data and the data that is being generated as a result of the work being done within these gig economies and the value being produced, just starting at a very high level, where do you see the opportunities for utilizing, whether it's rider data, driver data, or its equivalent in other kinds of gig economies, for creating more value for all of the participants? Let's take all three classes: the riders, the drivers, as well as the company itself.
Yeah. So, maybe a good place to start is, how do we even define value for each of the stakeholders that you just pointed out?
Absolutely.
And roughly speaking, if you think about what drivers or earners want, they want access to these platforms. They want higher and more stable income streams. They want benefits, and they want flexibility on their schedule or how they're able to work. So that's earners. If you think about sort of riders or consumers, they want lower prices. They want faster services, or let's say in the case of Uber, it's basically faster ETAs. The car needs to get faster. They want a seamless experience around accurate pickups, accurate drop-offs. In the case of Uber, just things should just work. In the case, broadly speaking, of products and services, they want greater choice of products and services that meet different types of use cases and needs. And then safety is another big angle that consumers want when they look at particularly a service like Uber or Lyft. So that's riders. Then you mentioned there's obviously the company itself, and what the company really wants is high growth and high margins, and those are typically unlocked through opening up access to the platform for a greater percent of the population. You can do that through new channels, new products and services. You can do that through lower prices and through just a better experience overall. And much of that is really unlocked through, or many of those things actually unlocked through a lower cost structure that then unlocks opportunities where you create value that can be passed on in lower prices or higher margins or whatnot. So those are a few other things that we can obviously explore. And then maybe the fourth stakeholder really is society at large, and what society at large wants, particularly in the instance of something like ride-sharing companies, is basically lower pollution, lower traffic, and cheaper and more accessible transportation, and cheaper and more accessible city living in general. And those are a couple other themes that we can explore as well as we go down the conversation. So maybe one thing we could do is sort of start looking at each of those. Maybe we'll pick one example from each bucket or each group and look at how we've sort of thought about data. We can think about data and in creating value in one example in each of those, if that sounds good.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's actually the way we like to think about from a data economic perspective about something like this is like, how can we use the data that's being generated as a result of work being done in the economy as the raw material to build new products. Right. So talking about what you just did, maybe we can think about a use case slash a product that can be developed out of the data being generated for each of these classes. I think that would be perfect.
That sounds great. So let's maybe start on the rider, the consumer side, since I think that's how many of us obviously think. That's the world we tend to often live in. So one of the things I find quite fascinating about many of these tech companies that are generating the volume of data and the richness and the granularity of data that you were just describing, is basically these companies are usually launch with a successful but single broad product that has wide applicability, but in a bit of a vanilla sense. And then customers will start using that in innovative and hacky ways. And really good companies will analyze that customer behavior and how the customers are using their product, and realize that there's actually ways to create niches or specialized products in specific areas where the vanilla product they rolled out doesn't totally meet the needs. And if they did that, it would produce a much better experience. The example that comes to mind here is, of course, Google, where Google search is a excellent but ultimately pretty vanilla sort of product that has broad applicability. And we've all sort of run Google searches in hacky ways to try and get some of the information we might seek. A great example is, I'm assuming Google noticed early on that a lot of users were searching for hotels and flight prices and things like that. With a somewhat subpar experience, is you had to click through a bunch of links to get all the info you needed. And then they just created a little amazing hotel specific search results page right up top when you're searching for hotels. So really cool. And you're seeing more and more companies start to do stuff like that. And so in the case of ride sharing of Uber, you can imagine a couple of years into ride sharing companies history, you start analyzing the massive amounts of data that's being generated. And one of the first things you probably notice are that there are specific demand patterns in a city, and around when and how users are moving around in a city. And so you notice that demand tends to spike on weekdays between say 7 to 9:30 in the morning, and then again between 4 and 6:30 in the evening. And then you've got some other patterns as well, but that would intuitively align with what you expect around commuting patterns in a city, which makes sense. And then you could also cut that data by neighborhood, and then you see something more interesting, which is, okay, trips tend to originate in the mornings around particular neighborhoods, and then they end, which are largely probably residential, and then they end in particular neighborhoods, which are probably commercial areas where offices exist or public transit services are aggregated. And then in the evening, you see a reverse pattern that sort of takes shape, and all kind of intuitive stuff. And then you might even notice that certain users, anonymized, of course, are sort of taking trips every morning from that area you just looked at, but within a couple blocks of each other and within a 15-30 minute window of each other. And they're more or less going to the same downtown or commercial area where they happen to work a few blocks away from each other. And if you then apply that to your own personal experience, where you maybe shared a ride with a friend and then Venmoed them after, you start to put together that, okay, if these two users who don't know each other probably start to share this ride, it could cost them 50% of what they're currently paying. And you put all this together, and you basically have all the makings of a pooled rides product. And Uber's version is obviously called Uber Pool. And so that's sort of the way that it comes about. And the challenge with a product like this, of course, is do you run it everywhere all the time? In which case, the likelihood of successful matches is low, and then you as the company are bearing the risk on that, and so you're running larger losses. Or is it only really available during peak hours and areas? And you contrast that, or you compare that against the bus model, which is very similar, which is the large vehicle pooling rides running on a fixed
That's a great
time.
Yeah, I had never thought about that, but what a great insight there.
And buses are typically set up to roughly on these demand patterns, and that's one goal of it. And then the other goal of it, of course, is civic coverage, which is I might even run a bus in a less dense area where the likelihood of matches is super low. And I might update some of these routes once every 7-10 years because of the lack of data, or just setting up these services. The upside with something like Uber here is the amount of granular and rich data that you have in knowing these demand patterns in time and space, how they're evolving rapidly, and also where the user is actually going, versus a bus where once the user gets off the bus, you actually have no idea where they went or what they did. And so you can start to use some of this type of data in really interesting ways on Uber, and use the likelihood of a match to adjust your prices and where you provide coverage at what type of frequency and depth in really interesting ways. And actually, you can then get to a world where if you think about a bus, it's really a large fixed cost with a pretty low variable cost. And so if you started a route and you weren't seeing enough volume on it, or you're doing it for civic coverage purposes, and now you're running really large losses on these, 15-20% of your routes, you can consider replacing that with a ride sharing company service, where you've got
Right.
a high variable cost and low fixed cost structure. And it's actually much cheaper to provide the same level, maybe even a better experience through some of those types of services. You can just take half the subsidy that you're paying out on some of these public transit services, divert them to a service like Uber, and come out with a better experience at half the cost.
I mean, just to riff on that for a second, I'm just curious if you're able to share, um, what's the I mean, how did you decide where to draw that boundary? Because it sounds like, given the case that you were just making, it's like, wow, like the natural conclusion to that is that instead of having a ride sharing service, just have a very high volume, essentially scheduled service. Like, so we basically optimize for the routes that people are taking, and then just make sure that the drivers are going through that routes, picking up whoever is on there, because that goes even one step further and taking out the variable cost structure even more. So I'm just curious, like, where do you draw that line between making it kind of like a much more modularized and a higher resolution bus system versus still having the on demand aspect to it? I mean,
Yeah,
it still could be on demand, given, like, if the frequency is high enough, then that it really doesn't matter whether I'm waiting 5 minutes for my driver to show up because I ordered it, or because it's someone is supposed to come by my route every 5 minutes. So
yeah,
I just
exactly.
just curious, just off the top of my head.
It's a great question. I don't think we've really figured it out, but it's something that's being iterated and experimented on. If you look at if you sort of look at the Uber Pool product and what some of the new features and services that have been introduced, and how it's just run. And there are other companies like Via and Lyft and Chariot and that have experimented with this model too. I don't think we've really cracked the nut. And it is, as you said, which is, I want to provide flexibility in time and space. I could fix
Right.
the route on
Right.
a space basis, but maybe I run it quite frequently on a time basis. And you can lower your cost structure by fixing both quite well and limiting it to really busy corridors. Or you can, but the downside of that is you may not pick up enough volume, at
Mm,
least in the short term. It might take a very long time for people to know the service and realign their life and transportation patterns to
yeah.
start incorporating the service, kind of like you would do with a bus or a train.
Right.
Or you could go super on demand, in which case you'll pick up a lot of demand volume, but getting the economics right is
Right.
challenging. And so there's probably a middle ground between the two. And I think some experimentation needs to be done, and some data needs to be looked at around demand patterns, cost patterns, what you might do, how technology is evolving, what size of vehicle you use that provides some comfort, but still enough volume density to make the cost economics work, et cetera, to really get this right.
That's fascinating. And, just extending that idea for a second, if we flip that model and actually looked at what government and civic services, transportation services, could actually learn from what rideshare companies are learning and deploying, do you think that that we can encourage more people to potentially take advantage of public transit services if they potentially not necessarily partnering would be one way, but adopted some of these learnings and lessons or models that rideshare companies are pioneering? Or do you think that there is no kind of relationship there?
No, I think it's a great point, and there's definitely something there. Maybe riffing a little bit on what you were saying, there's a world where some network, some corridors, or some parts of cities cannot be provided a particular level of SLAs in a cost-efficient manner, and at that point, it's unlikely that any private company is going to do that. And so you either need a public model, or you need public subsidy to make that happen. And it's really up to governments on whether they choose to deploy a public model or whether they choose to use the subsidy. And I think that's where the partnership that you described comes in. That's one angle. And so, I think governments could study some of these models and then make a call on which way they want to go. Do they want to invest with a lot of resources or with just capital and subsidy? The other way that this could work is, as we see sort of, the consumerization of the experience of some of these public transit services and better connectivity from your home to the public transit station, you might see an uptake in public transit usage. So if I can give you great coverage of a bike and scooter right outside your house, you might be more likely to take that to a train and then take that train over a longer distance, versus otherwise you're gonna have to figure some other thing out and you might end up buying a car.
Yeah, it's the last mile problem, which we know drives a lot of demand around cars.
Exactly.
That's fantastic. What a great angle to think about. Switching gears for a second, if we focused on the worker, the gig worker, let's say the driver in Uber's case, what is the what are the challenges and friction areas that someone might face in getting access to the platform and getting access to actually being able to enter the economy as a worker? Because as you've said, there are lots of gatekeeping mechanisms in kind of like the non independent worker economy, right? Interview processes, hiring processes, you name it. But when it comes to gig workers, the there is both the aspect of actually having the resource and experience to do the job safely and well, as well as actually being able to perform or produce at a level that generates consumer satisfaction, company satisfaction, while also in an ideal world maintaining quality of life. Because as you've said, I have friends who have made a choice to essentially drive full time, but just because it lets them pursue what they really want to do or what they want to build with their time. It was actually very interesting, just a general anecdote. When I moved to Los Angeles from the Bay Area, I mean, obviously Uber's been around in the Bay Area for a very, very long time. But when I moved to LA, I found more people, like way, way more people who were driving full time than who were in the Bay Area. And that was mostly because that economy just caters really well to artists and others who want to do things with their time, which is not necessarily a 9 to 5 schedule based thing. But that's, and they are very happy. They get to meet people. I've heard of experiences where people have landed jobs and acting gigs through by just giving people rides. Anyway, just dialing it back to the question, which was like, what are some of the challenges that you see in making this option available to more workers who might want to use this as an option for earning, as a lifestyle choice, whatever it might be?
Yeah, absolutely. So, continuing down the theme of looking at the internal data to understand some of these opportunities or challenges, um, in the early to mid days of Uber, you'd sort of look at the sign up flow or the sign up funnel data, and
Right.
you'd see that a lot of drivers were signing up to use the service. But as you obviously know, you basically need a car or you need a vehicle to drive on Uber. And a lot of these drivers were signing up, showing intent to drive, but they would basically check the box that said, we don't have a vehicle. And so you had this, you had this mismatch between demand for driving on Uber, but just not, no supply of vehicles that were available to them. And there's a number of reasons why they, wouldn't have vehicles, but sort of this access to vehicles turned out to actually be a pretty significant barrier to earning on the Uber platform. And, this was something that was certainly surprising to me in the US. But then when you look internationally, this problem is maybe 10x bigger, where the people that own cars in places like India, Brazil, or other economies is very different from the people that actually are driving those cars. So you obviously have a lot of fleet operators and owners, but there's kind of that mismatch there. But even in the US, you see a pretty high percent of people that face this issue. And so, a significant, one of the things that we did a few years ago was we started partnering with companies that would provide rental cars or cars that you could rent for some period of time or lease, and connecting them with the drivers that wanted to drive on Uber but couldn't because they didn't have a car. So, I'm thinking of like the Hertz and the Avises of the world. That said, once we started doing that, we realized that renting a vehicle can actually be challenging if you don't have great credit, or if you don't have a good FICO score, or you don't have the ability to put down a large deposit to compensate for that. And so every time you go and rent a car, they're typically looking at your credit or looking at, whether you put a deposit down, etc. And if you sort of look at the demographic of the full-time drivers that are driving on Uber, or even some of the people that you were just describing, right? You're looking at sort of, artists or people that are struggling early in their career, trying to figure out what they want to do. They're doing, 3 or 5 different types of independent gigs to make ends meet. These aren't people that can go and put down a $500 or $1,000 deposit on a car each week, because they don't really have that cash flow. Many of them are living paycheck to paycheck, and so that's a bit of an issue. But the reality is that many of these people might actually be quite creditworthy. And what I mean by that is, someone may have been working steadily on TaskRabbit for the last 12 months and have good cash flow, just not very good credit. And similarly, someone might have been driving on Uber itself for 12 months, but their car has gone to the repair shop, or they've otherwise lost access to their car because someone in the family's taken it. And so now they have this gap that they need to go do. And I think that was some of the first realization around the fact that, credit as it's traditionally developed is basically developed for a full-time W-2 traditional employment model, where they're basically, are looking for a steady and predictable earnings work stream. And if you don't have that, and the other thing that they do is they sort of look at credit cards and maybe mortgage payments as your source of credit, or that's how credit is generated historically. And so if you don't have either of those, which is credit cards and mortgage payments driven strong credit, or a W-2 driven source of income, then you basically don't have access to credit, or you are served extremely high interest rates on your loan, because people think you're highly likely to default and need to compensate for that. So you've got this sort of large mismatch in credit of people that are actually creditworthy, but just don't have the income stream or the credit quality to prove that, because the reality is that we haven't evolved the definition of credit and how we analyze and evaluate it with these new models of gig work and independent work, etc. Tactically, it's because of what we just talked about, which is gig workers have infrequent and unsteady income, and it's not on a W-2. And so what that basically means is there's just less visibility into their cash flows that companies have. And this isn't just a Uber driver, Lyft driver phenomena. This actually is a thing that impacts even small and independent business owners, where you can think of being a small independent business owner. You're sort of you've made a payment, you've shipped goods to your customer, they haven't paid you back. And so you've got this cash flow gap on working capital that you need to bridge. But if you go to a traditional lender, they just don't have their evaluation of your risk profile is very different, and they're not going to be able to loan you, make that loan to you at rates that you would want, or that align with your actual creditworthiness. And so you'll end up sort of what might happen in the older days is that you're either paying a high interest rate on that short-term loan, or you're actually just producing less goods because you don't have the working capital to bridge the gap that shows up from these. So that's a little bit of the issue. And what often happens with gig workers is if they don't have credit cards because they're on debit cards or just a cash-based system, and they don't have a mortgage because they're not able to afford one, their first exposure to credit is actually through unpaid bills or some other type of thing, which means they're starting with bad credit. And so right out of the gate, they're actually not eligible for things that might help them even build their credit. And so you've got sort of some of those types of things that are happening as well, which presents a few other challenges. And so what what you basically need to do is improve the types of data sources that inflow into credit and start looking at alternative credit sources. Like, for example, it's a little bit crazy that things like rent and utilities or phone bills aren't actually factored into your credit until somewhat recently, and only on particular types of credit applications. So those are some of the mismatches that are existing in a larger and larger swath of the population that's trying to do gig economy independent work, and this traditional finance, particularly credit system, that's existed for a long time. And so, you sort of think about, okay, how do I go about solving this? And, at its core, as we were just discussing, you basically are trying to solve a data issue on where, work has been performed, but, payment hasn't yet been received, or work has been performed, but you're just not ingesting that data into your credit systems to give it the credit that it actually deserves. And so those are the two things. So you can solve those in basically two ways. The first is you want to find ways to capture this data further upstream and more in real time than you otherwise did. And if you do that, you're actually going to lower your risk on these types of loans. So I'll give you an example. If I can capture, let's assume that you're an Uber driver and you drove last week, you haven't been paid by Uber yet because it's a weekly pay cycle and you get paid on, say, a Monday or Tuesday. But now you have this need for cash to sort of buy groceries, fill your gas, do whatever you might need. But you've already driven for 4 days, so Uber owes you money, they just haven't paid you yet. And so if I can now capture that data directly from Uber's app, I can lower my risk on extending you a loan at fairly low interest rates versus the shark loan approach, which is what might otherwise happen. Similarly, if I'm a small business owner and I've shipped goods to somebody, but they just haven't paid me yet, if I can start capturing the waybill of goods that's been sent via a 3-week shipping setup, then I can have certainty by analyzing the waybill of goods or analyzing the data capture along the shipment way, where I can then lower my risk profile and saying, yes, this is actually a legitimate transaction and the vendor is more likely to pay than not, and I can extend a working capital loan to this small business owner. So that's a little bit of how you can capture data upstream and more in real time. The second angle is around sort of traditional banks or credit unions or some of these newer fintechs, just capturing capturing different types of data sources. So basically, capturing data coming from gig economy players directly, or capturing data from Venmo, any of the other popular digital tools that folks are using to track expenses or track their finances. And if you do that, you just all of a sudden have a much greater set of data that you can analyze, and you can analyze that data to get a richer picture into the particular user. You can also use it to forecast their cash flows and the volatility and get comfortable with the volatility and therefore the inherent risk that exists here. And then again, it allows you to lower your risk and expand the market that you're going to serve quite considerably. Otherwise, many of these gig workers are basically out of reach for you if you're not capturing that type of data and that type of service. So in effect, it's really a shift in approach from the traditional W2 approach towards integrating and analyzing key data from various sources where data is being captured today, and also capturing it upstream in real time to bridge those two different solutions. And actually, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because some of the work that you guys are doing around smart contracts is actually very well positioned to solve some of these types of issues, because that smart contract is going to deliver some of that data in much more real time than has traditionally kind of happened. So it's actually very much suited to do this in a low cost automated type of manner.
Yeah, actually, it's very interesting that you bring up the whole credit worthiness angle. I think that first of all, it's amazing that all of these things that you're talking about, which is the fact that that I have done some work and I'm waiting to get paid for it, right? That is holding up my ability to live my life. just because people don't have visibility into it. That kind of stuff is just amazing that our credit systems don't already take that into account. But I think that that boils down to, again, as most things, to a lack of incentives on the part of people who are actually setting up the systems to make it any granular, because at the end of the day you just need a measure, and the people who are suffering are the ones that, as you have pointed out over and over again, who just don't have access to the resources to generate those specific measures, but that they're generating other outcomes that can serve just as well, if not as better measures of quote unquote that credit worthiness. So I think we have a session on Friday, actually, which our good friend Vinay from Venmo is going to be on, and part of what I believe he wants to discuss is exactly this: is the idea of a credit system that is based on financial data that is owned and controlled by the user who's generating the data, but they can make it available, very in a very highly controlled, regulated manner to as a platform to people who want to query it and generate value for them. So whether it's a credit system or something adjacent to that. So I think that this is, for us, an extremely important use case, both because financial data, along with health data, is one of the most sensitive type of data that exists. So making sure that that's well protected, which, if you actually do some research in the marketplace today, it's shockingly not well protected, and quite the opposite in terms of the way it's getting utilized and monetized without users' consent, or more importantly, any credit flowing back to them, whether it is in the form of better credit, or in the form of like actually receiving credit in monetary or other forms. So anyway, having said that, I think that it is very important that issue gets addressed. And I think that, to your point, we are seeing the beginnings of that, because there are enough companies, or enough institutions with resources, who are now interested in enabling those services for consumers. But I think that, to your point, I think there just needs to be a general shift in attitude towards independent workers, towards gig workers, and treating them as essentially equals, in as far as being productive producers for the overall economy, and give them the same tools and benefits. And speaking of which, one of our favorite conversations internally, I know, and just in general, are taxes. And I kind of can only be horrified at the thought of like how these folks actually go about filing their taxes, or what kind of pitfalls they might be falling into, and how some of this kind of systems that take advantage of their data that's being generated through their work can potentially help in that very important aspect.
Yeah, taxes is definitely another interesting area that I didn't really have much idea about at all until I've spoken to drivers and understood what they do with this on a every year in March and April. And what I've basically heard is some version of taxes are basically set up for, you get a W-2 from some employer. You enter your income streams, you enter some expense deductions that you might have, or some deductibles you take, and that's kind of it for most of us that sort of work in this W-2 world. But if you're a gig economy worker, or you have your own independent business, it's much more complex. And let's just take a gig economy worker as an example. Odds are that you're working for 2 to 5 different services over the course of the year, and so you've got sort of multiple income streams that are coming through. And then you want to deduct some of the expenses that you're taking on to provide these services. So fuel, depreciation, maintenance, all that good stuff. But the reality is that you don't have clarity on which of those you can deduct and how much you can deduct, as how much of those qualify for expenses in providing an Uber, Lyft ride is completely unclear. And then the second is, there's just no good way to track this expense data in a real-time way, particularly attributing to, let alone a trip on Uber, but just attributing what you did on Uber versus Lyft versus Via versus some other platform. And so the ability to kind of manage that is very nebulous. And what ends up happening is, many of these workers are doing their taxes, but they're overpaying taxes because they, don't know what they can deduct or what they can't deduct, and to, probably be on the safer side, they're taking fairly conservative approach to where it could be, when in reality they could be deducting quite a few expenses and paying a much lower level of taxes. So, you can imagine.
Education is so important, right?
Exactly. And so, I know that through companies like Uber and Lyft trying to do a better and better job of educating folks on what they can and can't deduct, and also partnering with H&R Block and a few of these other types of institutions to make sure that there is that information flow. And ultimately, you can imagine a world where you've got sort of apps that track your expenses, and they integrate with the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world, and then they also integrate with the H&R Blocks of the world and TurboTaxes of the world. And so if you connect all this quite well, you can then have data flowing quite seamlessly, and you can make the whole thing quite a bit easier. Because if you're off by a couple percentage points on your effective tax rate on your income, you're basically overpaying a few $1,000s of taxes every year, which is a very, very meaningful amount to anyone, but really particularly the demographic that we're sort of describing.
Wow, that's fascinating stuff. So we're coming up to the end of our time, unfortunately. I mean, I know that, Vaibhav, we could probably talk about this for 30 more minutes and then move on to talking about various movies and TV shows for another hour and a half. But in consideration of time, I'm gonna just ask the audience, if you have questions, this would be a good time to start putting them in the Q&A. So if there are any, then we can hit them before we have to let Vaibhav go. But just to start kind of thinking about what lies ahead, Vaibhav, and looking at two aspects specifically. I think we've talked a lot about the worker and their needs and the opportunities that lie there. But if we look at now at how does a company like Uber or one of its counterparts in other types of gig economies, um, what are the options available to them to use digital data to improve their cost structure, to generate or just demonstrate additional value through the data that they're generating, um, to help the company generate more value, which can then be passed on to the workers and the consumers. And then on the other front, what are the societal outcomes that the companies like this are hoping to enable, and what should consumers be looking for? What should consumers be asking for, according to you? Again, you gave the disclaimer, this is all your personal opinion, and I just want to repeat that. But it would be fascinating to kind of hear both those sides of what the company needs to make itself more efficient, show more value through digital data is generating, and then on the other hand, what are the outcomes that we want to see in society as a result of the gig economy, and what are the benefits that consumers should be asking for?
Yeah, both really interesting themes or interesting areas. We can touch quickly on both of them a little bit in the remaining time. So on cost structure, one of the things that was surprising to me, as I'm sure it was for most people when they looked at the S1s or the financial statements of these companies, is that insurance is actually one of the largest cost line items on the P&L, and which is a little bit of a surprising one. And it sort of comprises something like 9 to 15% of gross bookings, meaning for every dollar that you pay as a rider, 9 to 15 cents of that is going towards a insurance liability holdout that's used to cover
amazing.
Insurance liabilities that might happen on the platform. And ultimately that significant amount isn't really benefiting most riders or drivers. Yes, it's benefiting the small percent that do end up getting hurt or otherwise having an issue on the platform, but not broadly speaking. And it's also happening because clearly the platform is not safe enough just yet, and there are issues happening. And so finding a way to fix that is actually beneficial to everybody involved. And of course, I will say that this is a little bit of a US specific phenomena where we have a highly litigious society. So when something does happen, there's a high percent of lawsuits, and those lawsuits are in the millions of dollars, etc. But if you think about these insurance costs, it basically boils down to reducing one of two things. So you're trying to reduce the number of safety incidents that happen on the platform, particularly the high severity incidents. And the second is you're trying to lower the cost associated with each incident. And so I'm talking about the lawsuit liability of each incident. I'm less interested in the latter, but the former, reducing safety incidents, is actually more interesting. And incidents are basically of two major types. You've got your auto body incidents where cars collide. You've got physical damage to the car or maybe to you as a person as a function of that. And the second is interpersonal incidents where you've got sort of person-to-person physical or sexual assault or something of that sort. And if you just focus on the auto body type incidents, basically they're happening for a few reasons. You're either speeding, or you're drunk driving, or you're driving distracted, or it's a badly constructed road or turn, or seatbelts weren't worn, or you've got you didn't have a child restraining the car. Some version of that. A few factors. There's obviously various other factors for sure, but I think here's where we can actually use data in really interesting ways, much more so than was the case 10, 15 years ago. So if you think about it, when you analyze something like Uber's data or the data at Google Maps or Waze, you can now start to have really rich data in saying when and where are the majority of my accidents occurring in a city. And so I can tell that the majority of my accidents happen in this particular geography that tend to happen during commute hours when things are busy. So something's obviously happening there. And you can then go and use that data to, if you share that data with governments, you can start to find ways to fix whatever the issue is at that particular intersection or that particular location, that particular freeway exit, whatever that might be. You can also sort of pipe that back into your navigation systems and say, okay, in these hours, I'm actually trying to avoid this particular turn, or I'm trying to avoid this part of the city altogether, because I know that there's a greater likelihood that there's going to be an accident there. So that's another thing you can do. You can start to have better voice navigation on systems in a couple of ways. We were talking about distracted driving, so I'm sure you've noticed the better that Google Maps has become with their voice navigation, the less you're looking at your phone while you're trying to drive. And as they continue to make improvements there, you're less likely to look at it. And even today, you probably notice that there are times when, despite whatever Google Maps says to you, you still need to look at your phone and be like, okay, where exactly is the turn? Where am I going? Finding a way to fix that is going to be huge for distracted driving. There's various other technologies that have helped here. You can actually provide voice navigation when you're above a particular speed. So as you start to speed over the speed limit, you can start to use voice navigation to get people to come down. You can actually force drivers. One of the things we noticed in our data is when drivers are near the end of their shift, they're much more likely to be accident prone, which makes sense. You're at the end of an 8-10 hour shift, you're going to be accident prone. So finding ways to voice navigate that to drivers, get them to take a rest. Frankly, if you just force drivers offline, is another way that you can limit the risk that you have in these types of ways. And then sharing much of this data with cities is going to be super helpful in helping cities plan them for few accidents, but also better living, where I'm sure cities were first constructed with the best of intentions, but then residential and commercial areas pop up, traffic patterns change and various things happen, and so whatever you may have thought is actually now different. And so finding a way to use traffic patterns, whether it's auto traffic patterns or walking traffic patterns through Google Maps, which obviously has a lot of this data, you can find ways to sort of tweak cities or tweak what's happening in particular areas to make it safer and make it better, adjust the length of the sidewalk or adjust the lights or putting a light in place in the first place, or various things that can be explored are all super interesting. Maybe I'll touch quickly a little bit on the societal angle for a second. So there's obviously many ways that you would want a service like Uber to help. One is obviously reducing drunk driving. The second is having fewer accidents. There's some data and studies out there that show that Uber has had a positive impact on reducing drunk driving. I will say that obviously having worked there and believed in the mission, I think it intuitively makes sense, and it is hopefully happening at some extent. Proving these things can be quite difficult, where you've got a number of variables that are at play. You've got sort of state laws that are changing. You've got sort of long time frames. You've got improving vehicle technology. You've got changing access to public transit for communities. You've got sort of road and safety changes that are happening. So taking the correlation of a reduction in accidents to causation that yes, this is because of the launch and scaling of Uber and Lyft and other services can be quite challenging. So those are some of the challenges around conclusively proving it. But obviously, intuitively it makes sense that it's happening in these types of things. Another really interesting way that players like Uber and Lyft are helping is, if you think about it, Uber drivers that are on their cars moving around cities are actually your eyes and ears on the ground, capturing a ton of data that you're seeing in the city all the time. And very early on, we would notice that Uber drivers would pick up intel when there was an incident happening somewhere in the city, and they could live stream or live indicate that incident to the police force. And that type of information flow has actually helped faster finding of these incidents and faster response rate of these types of things, whether it's a wanted person or some other type of ring that's been busted, etc. So those are all interesting things that happen. And then maybe I'll pause there for any reactions you have before I move on to the next component of this.
No, absolutely. I mean, that is fascinating. I think that, I mean, you're making it so clear that there is so much more that this economy can impact the bigger economy through than, I don't want to say just, but just the services that the consumers are getting and the employment and revenue stream that the workers are getting. Beyond that, there just seems to be so much opportunity. And I think I'll just add one thing to address the question that was sent, which is, and I think you already addressed some of this, but with the vast trust of data available to Uber, could the company provide a method of microcredit to players of the gig economy? And would that credit create antitrust issues? So I think you already touched upon that, but I think, as you help us wrap things up, maybe you can address this question specifically too.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we've looked at. The challenge is, so I think you can absolutely do it, and as you were just pointing out, the gig economy player like Uber or Lyft actually has the most amount of data and insight and visibility into that workers' cash flows and their previous history on the platform, etc., which makes them very well positioned to make that microcredit loan. I think the challenge is, if you get into that business of making microloans, it actually requires you to become a credit or banking company or subsidiary, which then opens you up to a bunch of regulations, and you have to sort of you have to set that governance infrastructure up, which can often be a bigger headache than you might actually want. So I think it's something that I'm sure was thinking about, but it's best you got to wonder whether it's best done through Uber or best done in partnership with a third party player that specializes in something like that. That said, one of the things that we have done at Uber is, when we started to notice the demographic that needs urgent access to cash flow on a much more frequent basis versus the weekly or biweekly payment cycle that is on W2 models, what we've done is, at the end of the day or in more real time, you can actually cash out your earnings very basically immediately. So if I drive today on the platform, as soon as I finish 5 or 10 trips towards the end of the day, I can cash out my earnings and then use them to go and buy groceries, buy gas, or whatever I might want to do in my cash flow. So just speeding up the payment cycle because we have that certainty with the data that we already have.
Wow, that's amazing. I can. There's just so much I feel we've explored in the past hour, that I feel like already is being executed by companies like Uber and Lyft, and others, which is very heartening. And I think what's even more exciting is all of the boundaries that we can explore, because I think one of the big things we as the data economics company believe in is in empowering people um, through the data that they are generating and enabling them to do more with it, unlock more value that would otherwise not be available to them. And what better value than being able to control your time, do what you want with it, but still earn a comfortable living, and all the options that opens up, and all this additional value that can be generated by everyone who's participating in this. So thank you once again, Vaibhav, for your time and for your insights. This is just unbelievably important information that I think I hope is going to go well past just our conversation here. This is certainly going to be a goal for us to make sure that this kind of information is available to those who are thinking about starting these kinds of companies, who are building these companies, as well as hopefully those who are actually participating in these economies, so that they can start realizing the power that they have um, through the data that they're generating by participating. Um, anyway, Vaibhav, any final thoughts from you before we wrap up?
No, I think as you said, it's an exciting time. It's an exciting time in the world. There's a ton of data being captured really creatively, and finding a way to integrate all of that is going to be hugely beneficial to all types of customers and all types of stakeholders. So I'm excited to see where the world goes, and I'm excited to see what you guys do and how you guys are able to contribute in helping set up some of the infrastructure in this area. And so look forward to seeing what comes out of that. And thank you again for having me on.
Absolutely. Almost seems like a world beyond our world, doesn't it? Uh,
It certainly does.
all right. Thank you so much, Vaibhav. Hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you to the audience. You can reach me at arka@lydian.com with any questions that you have. If you want to connect with Vaibhav or have more questions with him, I'll be happy to relay those to him. Um, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate your time, and enjoy the rest of the festival.